Mr. President, we are at the last hour, if you will, the last day for sure, in dealing with what has become probably the biggest fiscal crisis that our country has dealt with in some time. And I've heard a number of my colleagues from the other side come down and talk about the importance of getting a solution. We all want to get a solution. You don't want to have a situation tomorrow where tax rates go up on everybody across this country that has an income tax liability. You obviously don't want to see our defense have to deal with what would be deep, deep cuts in our national security budget. Those are two things that will happen tomorrow unless Congress can act to prevent that. And so count me among those who wants to see a solution. I certainly hope that the negotiations that are occurring right now can conclude in a way that will give us an outcome that prevents those tax rates from increasing on Americans across this country, and also put in place some things that would actually deal with the real problem. And the real problem, Mr. President, is that our country spends too much. And we are where we are today because we haven't done our work when we should have previously. And if you think about the fact that for 3 consecutive years, 3 years in a row, in the United States Senate, we haven't passed a budget. We spend $3.5 trillion of American taxpayer money every single year. And for 3 consecutive years, we have not had a budget. And the majority leader and the chairman of the Budget Committee, others on the other side, have said, well, we passed a Budget Control Act in the August of 2011, and that sort of serves as our budget. Well, frankly, Mr. President, that isn't the case. The law requires us to pass a budget. We have a Budget Act enacted back in the 1970s that requires the Congress on an annual basis to lay out a plan for how we're going to spend the American taxpayers' money. And the reason we ended up with the Budget Control Act back in August of 2011 is because we'd failed to pass a budget earlier in the year. 3 consecutive years in the United States Senate, we've not passed a budget. Now, that isn't to say that our colleagues on the other side of the Capitol, the House of Representatives, haven't acted responsibly. You may disagree with how they did it, but at least they did it. They passed a budget. And the Senate, of course, has not for now 3 consecutive years. And so we went through this entire year. Everybody knew this was coming. This isn't a surprise. This is the most forecast and foretold disaster that we've ever seen. As we approach December 31st and the deadline that we're dealing with today, we knew that starting January 1st, taxes were going to go up on all Americans, at least all Americans who have an income tax liability. And we knew that these cuts that were put in place in the Budget Control Act in August of 2011 were going to occur. So there shouldn't be any element of surprise here. We've known about this for a long time. And yet for month after month after month after month this year, nothing was done about it. I say nothing in the United States Senate. Again, the House of Representatives earlier this year, last summer, passed legislation that would extend the tax rates for everybody for a year. They passed legislation that would replace the across-the-board cuts that will start to take effect on January the 2nd with responsible spending reductions that actually did something to bend the curve of all these runaway programs, entitlement costs that are going to bankrupt this country in future years. They made some necessary reforms. Again, people may not agree with them. And obviously, there should be a process where, in the United States Senate, we have an opportunity to vote on a budget and make amendments. And perhaps we would do it a different way. I might have voted for something entirely different. But the point is, I didn't have anything to vote for. Nobody over here did. We've been here for a whole year. And now we've got people coming up and saying, gee, I really wish that these negotiations will get us to an outcome. It's December the 31st. January 1st is tomorrow. It's 2013. Taxes go up. Everybody agrees it'll be a disaster for the economy. We can't allow that to happen. It'll ruin the economy. Well, where were we? Where were we for the past month and the month before that and the month before that, dealing with what we knew was going to be this very set of circumstances that we face today? And so I just find it really hard to sit and listen to people come up now and wring their hands and talk about, gee whiz, you know, I really hope we can get something done here on the last day as we put two people together, basically, to resolve this. Now, there was a discussion. In fact, everybody says, well, you know, the people that are getting together, it's the President, it was the Speaker at one time, now it's Senator McConnell, it was Senator Reid at one time, now it's Senator McConnell, and Vice President Biden. But up until Friday, Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, hadn't been consulted, hadn't been advised, hadn't been involved in any of this. And so he gets the call at the last minute to try and come in and sort of rescue this, starts a negotiation that goes over the weekend, and then Saturday night makes a proposal to the Senate Democrats and was told that we'll react to your proposal by 10 o'clock Sunday morning. Well, 10 o'clock Sunday morning passes, 11 o'clock, noon, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. He comes to the floor and says, we haven't heard back. And then the majority leader comes up and says, look, we don't have a counteroffer. We don't have a proposal. And so Senator McConnell then gets on the phone with Vice President Biden, and that's now where those discussions are occurring. They're occurring between Vice President Biden and Senator McConnell. But my point, Mr. President, is this. There are two people in a room deciding incredibly consequential issues for this country, while 99 other United States senators and 435 members of the House of Representatives elected by their constituencies to come here to Washington and to represent them are on the sidelines. Why didn't we have a bill on the floor of the United States Senate that we could actually debate? Why didn't we put something out here under regular order? Open it up. Allow senators to offer amendments. Allow them to have amendments voted on. You know, I might not have liked that outcome. Maybe I wouldn't have. Maybe I couldn't have voted for the final product. But at least we would have had an opportunity to debate this instead of waiting now until the 11th hour, where two people are gathered in a private room trying to negotiate something that has enormous consequences for this country and for our economy. We are where we are because this process was grossly mismanaged up until this point. And so now we're faced with a crisis. There's great drama. You listen to all the TV stations, at least those that cover what's going on here, and they're all talking about the fiscal cliff. And instead of a countdown till the end of the year, till the new year, we've got a countdown until we hit the fiscal cliff. What does that say? It is the most predicted financial crisis that we have ever known about. We've known about it for months. We've known about it since the temporary tax provisions were put in place 2 years ago. And yet here we are, the 11th hour on the final day, trying to negotiate with two people in a room, making decisions that will have a profound impact on the future of this country. And I have to say, Mr. President, that as I think about those negotiations that are going on, most of what is being talked about is who will pay more in taxes. Not a question of if, it's like who's going to pay more in taxes. And the ironic thing about it is, those discussions, at least to my knowledge of them, there is very little being discussed, if anything, that deals with how is this country going to figure out a way to spend less, which is the problem, okay? I mean, let's face it. Washington, D.C. doesn't have a taxing problem. We have a spending problem. Now, Republicans have said, and we are willing to contemplate this idea of having more revenues in the equation. Granted, the President won an election, and there's a majority of Democrats here in the United States Senate. That's their view. Obviously, we've got a Republican House of Representatives who has a different point of view about how to solve this and tried to do it by extending the rates for everybody so nobody would have their tax rates go up in the middle of a weak economy. There is a big difference of opinion about how to resolve this. But I would argue to my colleagues on both sides that if what comes out of these discussions is something that raises additional revenue, that raises taxes on people in this country, it doesn't do anything to solve the problem. In fact, if you give the President of the United States everything that he wants in terms of tax increases, you raise enough revenue next year to fund the federal government for less than a single week. So what do we do for the other 358 days of the year? A single week. That's what all these tax increases would amount to in terms of additional revenue. This is not a revenue problem. This is a spending problem that can only be solved by having the political courage to confront the challenges that face this country, not just in the near term, but in the long term, and to get us on a sustainable fiscal path. And that means we have to confront runaway spending and programs that, if not reformed, are going to bankrupt this country and saddle our children and grandchildren with an unbelievable burden of debt and a lower standard of living and a lower quality of life than anything that we or any previous generation, well, not any previous generation, but certainly our generation has experienced. Mr. President, that's where we are today. We are talking about how much taxes are going to go up. And those taxes are going to hit people who create jobs. If you use the $250,000 level, it's about 1 million small businesses who are impacted by these tax increases, who employ 25% of the American workforce. And so you've got lots of middle-income Americans, middle-class Americans, whose jobs depend on the very small businesses who are going to see their taxes go up. This will impact middle-American, middle-income, middle-class families in this country if taxes go up on small businesses. Now, if you raise that level to $400,000, it affects fewer, obviously. If you raise it to $500,000, it affects even fewer small businesses. But the point simply is this. You are hitting literally hundreds of thousands of small businesses who create millions of jobs for middle-class Americans with new taxes that they will be paying, and that can't do anything but hurt the very economy that we all say we want to get back on its feet. So we're talking about tax increases at a time we ought to be talking about spending. Why do I say that? Well, if you go back to 2007, before the recession, the revenues coming into the federal government were about $2.5 trillion, give or take, round numbers, okay? About $2.5 trillion. Well, this year, revenues coming into the federal government are going to be back to about $2.5 trillion. We went through a terrible recession. People call it the Great Recession. It had a profound impact on the economy. Obviously, a lot less economic growth, and a recession leads to lower government revenues, and so we had a period there where government revenues dropped. Well, government revenues are now back to where they were in 2007. Spending in 2007 was about $2.7 trillion. Today, it's more than $3.5 trillion. So spending has increased by almost $1 trillion. Almost $1 trillion in the last 5 years at a time when the revenues have stayed relatively flat. But the point simply is this. The reason we're running a $1 trillion deficit this year and the year after that and the year after that is because we have the spending of the federal government has exploded in the last 5 years. And so this isn't a revenue problem. The revenues are essentially the same as they were 5 years ago. Arguably, people would say if you had a growing economy, we ought to get more revenue, and we would if we had a growing economy. The goal ought to be to get the economy growing again at in a more robust fashion so that we're generating additional revenues coming into the federal government that would make these problems, the dimensions of these problems, look smaller by comparison. And that's why policies that hurt the economy, that slow economic growth, and everybody concludes that raising taxes in the middle of a weak economy is a bad idea if you're interested in generating more economic growth and creating jobs. That to me seems to be just an intuitive, I think everybody would agree with that, but certainly it's well known, a documented fact among economists that if you raise taxes, you're going to have lower economic growth. You're going to reduce the rate at which the economy grows and expands and therefore allows for job creation in this country. The best thing that we can do is to get the economy growing and expanding again, and then all these problems look much smaller by comparison. But that means having policies in place that allow small businesses to do what they do best, and that's to create jobs, that provide incentives to invest and to hire people. When you're operating in a period of economic uncertainty like we have today with these uncertain tax rates and where you've got tax rates that are going to go up, regulatory burdens that continue to go up, you constantly make it more expensive and more difficult for small businesses in this country to create jobs. Creating jobs, growing the economy ought to be our goal. That is so counterintuitive to think that raising taxes would somehow accomplish that goal. And so as we sit here at the last day before these tax rates go up, as we try and scramble now at the last minute to find a resolution, I would simply say, Mr. President, and urge my colleagues that we not let this happen again, that we not be here next year or the year after waiting while two people sit in a room and try and cut a deal that most of us have not been privy to or been consulted about, and the American people obviously are the ones who are ultimately impacted by that, but they haven't had an opportunity to have a role in this, to observe what their elected leaders are doing to solve the big problems that face this country. We ought to be functioning like the United States Senate used to function, and that is to put bills on the floor, to allow amendments to be offered and voted on, and then, whatever that outcome is, ultimately the House of Representatives will pass their version of it. Perhaps we'll have a conference committee. Hopefully we can get something that we can put on the President's desk. That's the way it used to work. But now we're sitting here because we have twiddled our thumbs for month after month after month. And here in the United States Senate, not passed a budget, not dealt with this issue in any substantial or meaningful way, and now we're sitting here on New Year's Eve. On New Year's Eve. And the countdown on the television isn't how many hours and minutes are left until we hit the new year. The countdown on the television is the number of hours and minutes that are left until the country goes over the fiscal cliff. Think about what that says about this process, about the United States Senate, 100 people elected to make big decisions to advance the interests and put this country on a better path toward a better future that is more secure, more safe, and more prosperous for our children and grandchildren. That's what should have happened. But it should have happened months ago. And so I hope we get a result here today that addresses some of these issues. It's certainly, hopefully, something that will address the tax issue. But, Mr. President, that doesn't solve the problem. If the President gets everything he wants in new taxes, it funds the government for less than a week. This is not a revenue problem. Washington doesn't tax too little, it spends too much. And until we recognize that and deal with what is driving federal spending, we are going to continue to saddle future generations with more debt, with more liabilities, with a lower standard of living and a lower quality of life than we've experienced, and that is not fair to them. It's time for us to demonstrate the political courage that is necessary to take on the big issues and to have the votes. Let's have a budget. Let's put it on the floor. Let's vote on it. Let's do something around here that matters, that is meaningful to the future of this country, rather than wait till the last day and the last hour and allow two people to sit in a room and decide the fate and the future of this great country.